Little girl sent a secret signal at the rest stop. Only 14 police dogs picked it up. The desert light was unforgiving that afternoon, the kind that washed every color into a pale, trembling shimmer. Heat rose off the asphalt in slow, fevered waves, turning the lonely Nevada rest stop into a mirage that felt half real, half dreamed. Cars drifted in and out, engines humming, doors slamming, people moving without looking too closely at anything around them. That was how no one noticed the old blue pickup parked at the edge of the lot. Its paint was peeling, its bumper held together by rust and stubbornness. It looked like a vehicle someone might abandon without a second thought. Which was why no one bothered to glance at the bed of the truck, where an 8-year-old girl sat curled deep in the metal shadow. Emily Carter's hands were tied so tightly at the wrists she couldn't lift them an inch. Her cheek was streaked with dust, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide and dry from fear so constant it had emptied her of tears hours ago. She tried not to move. Every twitch made the rope bite deeper. Every swallow felt like a scream trapped behind her tongue. She could hear voices all around her, a tourist arguing about soda flavors, a trucker laughing into his phone, a couple unloading snacks from their SUV. Life moved around her easily, carelessly, as if she wasn't there at all. A few yards away, Dale Kincaid leaned against the side of the restroom building. Sunglasses on, jacket zipped even though the heat pressed down like a hand. He looked like any road-worn traveler taking a break from the highway. No one paid attention to him either. They didn't see the way he watched the truck bed from behind the tint of his glasses. Didn't see how his jaw clenched each time Emily shifted. He had warned her. No sound. No screaming. No trying to escape. Emily believed him. But she also believed something else, something small and flickering and desperate, that she wasn't completely helpless. She pulled in a shuddering breath, pressing her back against the metal truck bed. She needed a signal, something too small for Dale to notice but strong enough to reach someone with the right ears. She lifted her heel, tapped once against the metal, a pulse of sound as quiet as a breath. She tapped again, then again. A faint rhythm, a prayer disguised as noise. It vanished instantly into the roar of the heat and the hum of the highway. No human could have heard it. She knew that. She almost gave up. Then, on the far side of the rest stop, a German shepherd lifted his head. Major was the oldest dog in the Clark County Canine Unit, a massive sable-coated shepherd with eyes that had once tracked explosives in Afghanistan. Even in retirement-eligible age, his instincts stayed razor-sharp. He lay in the shade near the picnic tables, resting beside 13 other canines, while their handlers grabbed drinks and stretched their legs. But something turned the air. A sound too small for humans. A vibration against metal. A pattern that didn't belong. Major's ears twitched, then snapped forward, his chest stilled. Emily tapped again. This time, he rose. Officer Daniel Hale noticed the movement in his peripheral vision. He'd partnered with Major for 4 years. He knew the dog's habits, moods, quirks. Major wasn't a dog who moved for no reason. The rigid stance, the locked eyes, the slow rumble in his chest, those were warnings Dan had learned not to underestimate. He crouched. Major didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on the far corner of the lot. "What is it, Bud?" Dan murmured. No reaction. Only tension. Major stepped forward. One stride. Then another. Before Dan could call him back, another shepherd stood up. Then a third. Then the entire line of canines rose like a single body awakened by the same invisible thread. 14 dogs, ears pinned forward, eyes burning into the same direction. The old pickup truck. Dan felt the hairs rise on his arms. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't restlessness. This was alarm. He followed their line of sight across the shimmering lot. Nothing looked unusual at first. Just an old truck half buried in sand. Looks abandoned, he thought. Then he noticed the tires. Fresh tracks. Dust scattered more recently than the rest. Major gave a sharp, throaty sound. Not a bark, not a growl. A warning he only used when something was deeply wrong. "Major," Dan said, heart picking up speed. "Talk to me." The dog didn't hesitate. He broke into a sprint, and the other 13 followed as if pulled by the same string. The sudden explosion of motion startled everyone at the rest stop. A woman screamed. A man dropped his drink. A little boy grabbed his mother's arm as the pack tore across the asphalt, kicking sand into the air behind them. Dan sprinted after them, shouting for handlers to move. But the dogs didn't wait for commands. They moved with absolute certainty. Emily heard the pounding paws before she saw them. At first she thought Dale had returned early. Her chest tightened, breath snagging. But then she peeked over the metal edge and saw them. 14 German shepherds racing toward her like a storm rolling across the desert floor. For a moment, her fear cracked open. Hope leaked through. Major reached the truck first. He leapt into the bed with a single powerful jump, landing beside Emily with a heavy thud. His shadow fell over her like a shield. His nose brushed her hands. His growl vibrated through the metal. Emily stared at him, shaking. He stared back, steady and fierce, as if telling her he understood. The other dogs circled the truck, forming a tight ring, blocking every angle. Travelers backed away in panic, thinking the pack was preparing to attack. But Dan felt it the moment he reached them. No aggression, only purpose. Major shifted to block Emily even more, tail stiff, muscles locked. Dan saw her then, the small bound wrists, the red marks, the dirt on her cheeks, the horror in her eyes. He sucked in a breath. "Dear God," he whispered. Emily flinched at the sound of a human voice, shrinking into the corner. Dan lifted both hands slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal. "It's okay," he said gently. "No one here is going to hurt you." Major didn't move aside. He watched Dan's every breath, every muscle, reading his intentions with the precision of a soldier. Then came the twist. Major suddenly turned his head back towards the desert, ears high, body trembling with warning. All 14 dogs shifted at the same instant, staring in the same direction. Dan froze, because the pickup bed held a terrified child. But the desert held something else. Someone was coming, and the dogs sensed it long before any human did. For a moment, the rest stop fell into an uneasy stillness, the kind that hangs in the air right before something breaks. The heat pressed down heavy, the wind held its breath, and every dog in the canine unit stood frozen like statues carved out of instinct itself. Major was the first to move. His paws shifted, claws scraping lightly against the concrete as he angled his head toward the old blue pickup. His ears locked into a sharp point, and the muscles along his spine tightened one ripple at a time. It wasn't aggression, it was recognition. A sound too faint for humans had threaded through the desert air, and Major had caught it like a memory. Officer Daniel Hale watched him closely. He had seen Major respond to gunshots, explosives, and hidden threats buried in walls of sand overseas. But this was different. The dog wasn't tracking danger. He was listening to something impossibly small. "Major," Dan said under his breath, "talk to me." The dog didn't break focus. Instead, his chest swelled with a sharp inhale, nostrils flaring at the faintest trace on the wind. Behind the metal wall of the truck bed, Emily tapped again. Her heel brushed the steel in a tiny, trembling rhythm. 3 taps. A child's last attempt at reaching a world too busy to hear her. Major heard everyone. His body stiffened, then he released a single, clipped woof that cut through the rest stop like a spark catching dry brush. It wasn't a command bark. It wasn't even a warning. It was a call reserved for moments that didn't fit any pattern he recognized, a sound he had made only 3 times in his career. All 13 other dogs responded instantly. Their heads snapped toward the truck bed as if pulled by a single wire. Some leaned forward, noses open, tasting the air. Others lowered their bodies into a hunter's crouch, scanning for movement. Their breathing changed, sinking into a collective rhythm of deep, steady focus. Dan felt his pulse kick into high gear. He had been a Marine before he was a handler, and both parts of him understood one thing with certainty. Dogs didn't act like this unless something was very wrong. "Handlers," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Get your eyes up." But even as he spoke, the tension shifted again. Major stepped forward, slow but deliberate, each stride harder, firmer, gathering momentum as if the earth itself was pulling him towards the truck. The other dogs fell in line behind him, forming a loose, arrow-shaped formation without a single command. It was the kind of unity no handler could train. It came from instinct, from a shared understanding older than language. Emily tapped again. This time the sound was so faint Dan didn't hear a thing, but the dogs reacted like they'd been struck by lightning. Major's tail went rigid. His eyes sharpened with a kind of furious urgency. His front paw lifted, paused, then slammed back to the ground as he lunged forward with sudden force. "Major!" Dan called. Too late. The dog broke into a sprint across the asphalt, and the entire unit exploded into motion with him. Travelers ducked aside, startled by the sudden stampede of fur and muscle barreling across the lot. A man cursed loudly as the dogs thundered past. A mother shielded her child. A family dropped their bags, stunned by the sight of 14 German shepherds racing with absolute purpose toward what looked like an abandoned truck. Dan's boots hit the ground hard as he ran after them, heart pounding like a drum. He could feel something building, something sharp and electric that crawled up the back of his neck. When the dogs reached the pickup, Major didn't hesitate. He leapt into the truck bed in one fluid movement. His weight crashed against the metal, echoing a hollow clang that jolted Emily's entire body. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest, eyes wide, unsure whether the thunder of paws was rescue or another nightmare. Major lowered his head and sniffed her wrists, the rope, the fear seeping off her like smoke. His growl rose low from his chest, not toward her, but toward the invisible threat surrounding her. Dan skidded to a stop at the side of the truck. The other handlers reached him a heartbeat later, all panting, all confused but alert. "What's going on?" one officer asked. Dan didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the girl. Her skin was pale, her lips trembling with a fear she didn't have words for. The rope around her wrists was frayed and cutting into raw patches of skin. She looked dehydrated, exhausted, and rescued by a miracle no adult had noticed. Then the plot twist hit fast. Major suddenly turned away from the girl and stared out toward the open desert again. His ears shot upward and a sound rose from his throat, deeper and sharper than before. A warning that struck every dog in the circle like a fuse. All 14 K9s swiveled their heads toward the same distant ridge of sand and rock behind the rest stop. Dan followed their gaze. Nothing moved out there. No figures, no vehicles, no shadows. But Major didn't need shadows. He stepped to the edge of the truck bed, teeth bared, chest puffed with a primal tension Dan hadn't seen since Afghanistan. His body shook with a certainty that chilled the air between them. Emily sucked in a tiny breath and whispered, barely audible, "He's coming back." Dan felt the words slice through him. Because Major wasn't just warning them, he was answering her. The explosion of movement looked like chaos to everyone who wasn't trained to understand it. 14 German shepherds suddenly broke formation and charged across the rest stop, claws scraping asphalt, bodies cutting through dust clouds kicked up under the brutal Nevada sun. Travelers screamed. A man dropped his coffee. A family scrambled back into their SUV, slamming the doors. To the untrained eye, it looked like an attack. But Dan Hale knew better the second his boots hit the ground after them. This wasn't aggression. This was urgency so sharp it had cut instinct free of every command. "Make way!" he shouted, trying to push past startled civilians. "Move aside!" His words were swallowed by the thunder of paws. Major reached the pickup first. He leapt into the truck bed with a single burst of power, the metal booming under his weight. A ripple of panic went through the onlookers. A woman cried out, convinced the dog was about to maul someone. Instead, Major froze. His head lowered, his nose brushed against something small, something human. Emily. She flinched, expecting pain. But the soft pressure of his muzzle against her wrists wasn't threatening. It was searching, reading her fear, her scent, the rope, the dust, the hours of terror clinging to her skin like a second shadow. And then he growled, not at her, at the world around her. Dan felt the sound in his chest before he heard it in his ears. A deep, rumbling note of pure, protective instinct. He sprinted to the tailgate, yanking himself up enough to get a clear view. The moment his eyes met Emily's, everything inside him tightened. She was small, too small for the kind of fear shaking her thin shoulders. The rope around her wrists was tied so tight her skin had turned raw. Her breath came in tiny, uneven stutters. Her lips were cracked, her eyes swollen. And when she opened her mouth, no sound came out. Dan swallowed hard. "Oh God, kid, hey, look at me. You're all right now?" She wasn't. Not yet. But it was all he could offer. Major shifted, placing himself more firmly between Dan and the girl, as if declaring that even a rescuer had to earn the right to come close. Dan raised both hands slowly, letting the dog read him. "It's okay, boy," he murmured. "I'm here to help her." Major held his gaze a moment longer, chest heaving with each breath. Then, just barely, he stepped aside, still guarding Emily but giving Dan enough space to reach in. The other dogs formed a tight half-circle around the truck, facing outward, hackles rising in a synchronized wave. Their focus wasn't on the girl anymore. It was on the desert beyond the asphalt. Something out there still held their attention. Something dangerous. Dan kept one eye on Major as he pulled out his pocket knife. He didn't want to startle Emily. Terrified kids could react in unpredictable ways. But as he knelt at the edge of the truck bed, she didn't pull away. She only watched him with a kind of hollow hope, her body trembling as though holding her breath hurt. "I'm cutting the rope now," he said softly. The blade slid under the knot, a quick slice. The rope snapped. Emily gasped, pulling her hands to her chest. She rubbed her wrists instinctively, checking if the pain was real or if freedom was another trick her mind was playing on her. "You're safe," Dan said. "You're safe, sweetheart." But she wasn't. Not entirely. Her eyes flicked past him toward the ridge of rocks rising behind the rest stop. Fear sharpened her expression so fast, Dan felt the shift like a chill crawling up his spine. "What is it?" he whispered. She tried to speak. Her lips moved, her throat tightened, but no sound formed. Panic rose in her chest, robbing her of breath. Major nudged her gently, pressing his forehead into her shoulder. The girl clung to him, fingers fisting in his fur. One of the other handlers climbed onto the bumper beside Dan. "Should we move her to the ambulance?" Dan shook his head. Something was off. Emily's entire body leaned unconsciously toward Major, as if the dog were the only thing holding her together. She kept her gaze fixed on the desert, eyes wide, unblinking. Dan followed her line of sight. Nothing moved out there. But the dogs were still staring, muscles wound tight. "Okay," Dan whispered. "Emily, listen to me. Was there someone else? Did someone put you here?" Her chin trembled. She nodded once, then twice. Dan exhaled slowly. Is he close? Emily didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. Instead, her shaking hand lifted and pointed towards the ridge. A sharp jolt ran through Dan's chest. He turned to Major. The dog had already shifted his stance, ears forward, tail straight, eyes fixed on the same place the girl pointed. The twist came a heartbeat later. From behind the ridge, a small rock tumbled down the slope. Then another. The dogs bristled as one. Emily whimpered. Dan's hand went to his holster. Someone had been watching them. Not trapped. Not fleeing. Watching. Dan gently pulled Emily toward him, but Major blocked the movement, stepping in front of her like a bodyguard who'd decided the threat was seconds, not minutes, away. "All right," Dan whispered, voice low, steadying. "This isn't just a rescue." He looked at Major. The dog didn't blink. "This is a hunt." And the predator hadn't left the scene. The desert behind the rest stop looked empty. Nothing but dunes, boulders, and heat rising in trembling waves. To most people it was just open land. To the canines, it was a crime scene screaming with signs no human eye could catch. Major was the first to move. He jumped down from the truck bed, landing hard enough to send dust swirling around his paws. His body angled toward the rear of the rest stop, nose lifted, drawing in the faintest scent riding the hot wind. In a blink, the other 13 dogs mirrored him, forming a line that looked less like animals and more like a trained tactical unit waiting on an invisible cue. Dan felt the shift in the air, a quiet electric tension. "Handlers," he said, voice low. "We follow their lead." Major stepped forward. All 14 dogs headed towards the desert as if pulled by the same thread. People at the rest stop watched with wide, uneasy eyes. Some filmed, some backed away. No one dared speak as the pack moved past the gas pumps and dumpsters, slipping behind the building like a silent storm. Emily reached toward Major as he disappeared from view, her voice locked again behind fear. Dan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He's not leaving you," he said softly. "He's finding whoever did this." She clung to the edge of the truck, trying to breathe through the panic clawing her lungs. Behind the station, the world changed. The ground was softer, sandier, the wind sharper. The noise of the highway faded until all Dan could hear was breathing, pause, and his own heart. Major halted suddenly. He lowered his head to the sand, nostrils flaring. The other dogs tightened their formation behind him. Dan knelt beside him, following the dog's gaze downward. Fresh footprints. Human. Full weight pressed into the heel, angled sharply as if the person had moved quickly, almost sprinting. The edges were still crisp, no more than an hour old. Maybe less. Another handler whistled under his breath. "Someone's been here, recently." Major moved again, circling left, pulling them toward a cluster of boulders. At the base of the rocks was a patch of disturbed sand, smoothed, then dented again. Someone had knelt here, maybe even crouched for a long time. Dan brushed the ground with the back of his hand. Warm, too warm. He was watching. Dan whispered, "This is a lookout spot." A small piece of cloth fluttered against a jagged corner of rock. Dan plucked it free. Stiff, dirty, torn from a jacket. One of the dogs let out a sharp breath, drawing their attention. A few steps beyond the rocks lay a half-crushed plastic water bottle. Not sun-bleached, not old. Major moved past it and sniffed deeper into the brush. The other dogs followed, weaving through mesquite branches and small stones. Their tails stiffened, their shoulders squared. They had the scent now. And the scent was close. Back at the truck, 3 dogs had stayed behind with Emily, forming a protective arc in front of her. They didn't look away from the desert. Their bodies stood between her and the world, each breath a silent promise that nothing would touch her again. Emily clutched the edge of the truck, watching the small shapes of the search dogs disappear into the shimmering heat. One of the remaining canines, Diesel, looked back at her, ears softening just a little. She slid one trembling hand into his fur. The dog leaned gently into her palm. Dan's voice crackled over the radio. Team 2 staying with the child. Team 1 is moving along the ridge. We've got multiple signs of recent activity. Emily's breath hitched. She pointed back toward the ridge as if confirming what the dogs already knew. Her eyes widened, pleading. Dan didn't miss it. "We're on it," he promised, though she couldn't hear him from where she sat. "We'll find him." Up ahead, Major suddenly stopped again. The wind shifted, brushing the desert floor sideways. The dogs inhaled sharply as one. Something changed. Something new entered the air, a second trail. Faint, but there. Dan crouched. "Hold on." Before he could finish, Major snapped his head toward the far right, toward a narrow split between two tall boulders. He let out a deep, vibrating growl, the kind that said danger wasn't behind them, it was ahead. The dogs surged forward, noses low, bodies coiled with purpose. They moved with increasing speed, weaving around rocks, tracking something human eyes couldn't see. Another handler shouted, "We need to notify search units. Whoever did this didn't run far." Dan didn't respond. His focus was locked entirely on Major. The dog was tracking harder now, breath sharp and rhythmic. The prints grew deeper, then lighter, then disappeared behind a patch of desert scrub. Major didn't stop. He scented the air, recalibrated, and angled left. A sudden plot twist hit fast. Near the edge of the ridge, half buried beneath the sand, was a second set of footprints. Smaller, lighter, a child's. Dan froze. Oh no. The dogs crowded the prints, circling the area. One barked, another growled. Major let out a low, distressed whine, the kind he used only when something was very, very wrong. Dan's stomach turned. Emily hadn't been the only child out here. He stood slowly, the heat shimmering around him, air thick with dread. The dogs weren't just tracking a fleeing suspect. They were tracking someone who had crouched, watched, and waited. Someone who hadn't acted alone. Someone who had possibly taken another victim before Emily. Major pressed his nose against the child-sized footprint again. Then he lifted his head toward the desert horizon, eyes dark and burning with meaning. Dan understood. This wasn't over. This wasn't even close. The desert wasn't hiding a man who'd run. It was hiding a man who planned to come back. And the dogs were ready for him. The desert ridge rose like a jagged spine behind the rest stop, its shadows stretching long and thin as the sun dipped lower. Major followed the fresh scent trail with unwavering focus, weaving through patches of desert scrub. His growl vibrated low, steady, a warning still gathering its weight. Dan stayed close behind, adrenaline sharpening every breath. Then a sudden rustle echoed across the rocks. Major snapped his head toward the sound, teeth bared, tail rigid. A man stumbled out from behind the boulders. He raised both hands immediately, stepping backward as 14 dogs turned on him with a wall of ferocity that nearly knocked him off his feet. "I didn't do anything!" he shouted, voice cracking. "I was just resting, man!" Major lunged instinctively but halted inches away, nose flaring. The other dogs followed suit, forming a semicircle around the stranger. They sniffed, checked, analyzed. Their bodies were tense but uncertain. Dan moved in fast, hand hovering above his holster. "Don't move." The man froze, eyes flicking between the snarling dogs and the officers scrambling up the ridge. He was thin, wearing an oversized hoodie damp with sweat. His breathing was ragged, but not the kind of ragged that comes from a chase. More like fear or guilt. Dan stepped closer, searching the ground around him. No matching shoe prints, no rope fibers, no matching dirt on his cuffs. Wrong shoe tread entirely. "Is this him?" one officer whispered. Dan looked at Major. The dog stared at the stranger for a long, silent moment. Then, without warning, he turned away. The other canines followed instantly, abandoning the man as if he had ceased to exist. Dan exhaled sharply. "It's not him." The stranger sagged with relief, hands still trembling. "I swear I didn't touch that girl. I heard yelling and I hid. Thought someone was getting attacked." Dan barely heard him. The dogs were already moving again, picking up a stronger, darker scent trail. Major's pace quickened. Something ahead had triggered him deeply enough to override every instinct but one. Back at the truck, Emily sat between 3 canines still guarding her like a living barricade. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, her breaths sharp, unsteady. She held Dryden, the youngest dog, who kept nudging her ribs gently as if trying to help her breathe slower. Her voice, fragile and unused, cracked open at last. He said," the paramedic crouched beside her, "Sweetheart, it's okay. Take your time." She pressed a hand to her throat, pushing through fear thick enough to choke. He said, "They're coming back." The words were barely audible, but every officer within range went rigid. Dan turned toward her instantly. "Who's they?" Emily shook her head hard, tears welling. "I didn't see them, but he talked to someone. On the phone. He said they were close." A cold ripple ran through the air. The canines guarding her reacted first. Their ears pricked, their bodies stiffened. A low cascade of growls rolled through them like a fuse catching flame. They all turned in perfect unison towards the highway entrance of the rest stop. Dan's pulse kicked hard. "Something's coming!" At that exact moment, a rumble broke the silence. Not the soft hum of a passing car. A deeper engine, heavier, faster. Dust erupted at the far end of the lot as a black SUV barreled into view, fishtailing as it hit the pavement too fast. Travelers screamed and scattered. Someone dropped a bag of chips. Someone else dove behind their car door. Emily's eyes widened in terror. "That's his car," she whispered. The dogs launched into motion before any human commanded them. Major tore across the lot, sprinting like a bolt loosed from a bowstring. The others followed him in a formation so tight it looked choreographed. Their paws hammered the ground, each stride more explosive than the last. Dan shouted into his radio, "Vehicle approaching! All units move!" The SUV didn't slow. If anything, it accelerated. Straight toward Emily. Dan's stomach dropped. "No, no, no!" Trent, another handler, grabbed his arm. "They're going to ram the truck." Major reached the pickup first, leaping onto the tailgate with enough force to rock the entire vehicle. He put himself between Emily and the oncoming SUV, his body straight, ears pinned, a growl ripping from his chest so loud it echoed like an engine. The other dogs formed a barrier around the truck, snarling, barking, claws digging into the asphalt. The SUV screeched to a sudden stop only feet away, its grille inches from the wall of dogs ready to tear it apart. A moment of silence followed. A long, vibrating second that stretched thin across the heat. Then the driver's door flew open. A man stepped out, tall, filthy jacket. Cold eyes Emily recognized instantly. Her breath collapsed into a sob. "It's him." Major's snarl deepened into something primal. The man lifted his hand slowly, a twisted smirk curving across his face. "I'm only here for what's mine." Dan drew his weapon. "Step away from the vehicle." The man's smile widened. "You think you stopped anything? You think she's the only one?" Emily shook violently. "No, no, no!" The SUV engine ticked hot in the silence. Major lowered his head, shoulders rising like a cresting wave. Dan felt it. The shift, the split-second warning. "Everyone move!" he shouted. Because the kidnapper wasn't surrendering, he was preparing to charge, and he was stupid enough to try it in front of 14 dogs trained to unleash hell. Dale Kincaid moved with the kind of reckless desperation that made the air itself feel thinner. He slammed his SUV door open and lunged toward the pickup, where Emily sat trembling behind the living shield of 14 canines. Dust exploded around his boots as he sprinted, his face twisted with a feral determination that sent a cold wave through every officer on the lot. Emily's scream barely escaped her throat before terror strangled it. Major was already airborne. He launched from the tailgate with a force that rattled the truck, his body arcing through the desert heat like a missile made of muscle and instinct. The other dogs followed in a synchronized surge, fanning out around him. In a tight formation, their paws pounding the asphalt in a blur of speed and fury. Dale reached into his jacket as he ran. Dan saw the glint. "Weapon, he's armed!" Everything happened in a split-second collision of motion and instinct. Dale swung first. The metal pipe sliced the air in a vicious arc aimed straight at Major's skull. But Major had survived far worse. He twisted mid-leap, shoulder taking the hit instead of his head, the pipe glancing off fur and bone. He didn't slow. He barreled into Dale's chest, knocking him back 2 staggering steps. Dale roared, swinging again wildly, but 2 more shepherds closed in on him, blocking his arms, cutting off his angles. They snapped and dodged with precision, not biting, only diverting, redirecting, forcing him to lose balance with every swing. Dan sprinted in behind them, adrenaline threatening to drown out his training. "Back! Major! Back!" Major obeyed instantly, dropping low. That split second opened a path for Dan. But Dale wasn't done. He yanked a second weapon from his belt, a knife, jagged, dirty, its edges scratched with rust and something darker. He whipped it toward Dan in a frenzied slash. 2 canines collided with Dan from the side, knocking him out of the blade's deadly path. They took the fall with him, absorbing the impact before scrambling back to their feet with growls that vibrated the ground. Dale turned the blade on the dogs. Major lunged again, faster than the swing. He hit Dale at the elbow, teeth clamping around the man's wrist with perfect, controlled force. Not a maiming bite, a tactical one, strong enough to drop the weapon, precise enough to avoid tearing muscle. Dale screamed as the knife clattered to the pavement. 3 more dogs flooded in, pinning Dale's legs, his torso, his free arm, their bodies moving like a living machine built for one purpose: containment. Dale thrashed against them, veins bulging in his neck, spit flying from his mouth. "Get off me!" he roared, kicking wildly. The dogs tightened their grip, their bodies sinking lower, their weight pressing him down. They didn't bite flesh. They didn't attack out of rage. Every motion was calculated, trained, purposeful. Dan sprinted forward, shoving past one of the handlers. He tackled Dale's shoulder, forcing the man fully onto his stomach. Gravel scraped skin. Dale writhed, but the dogs held him immovable. "Hands behind your back!" Dan yelled. Dale bucked once more. Major growled, a deep, primal thunder that froze Dale mid-struggle. Dan seized the moment. He wrenched Dale's arm behind him, slapped a cuff around the wrist, dragged the second arm into place, and locked the other cuff with a metallic click that echoed across the lot like a final verdict. "It's over," Dan breathed, sweat running down his face. "You're done." The dogs stayed locked around Dale until Dan gave a subtle hand signal. Only then did they retreat by inches, forming a tight arc between Dale and Emily, ready to spring at the slightest wrong movement. Dale stopped fighting, stopped breathing for a beat. Then he began to laugh. It wasn't the laugh of a cornered man. It was cold, mocking, a laugh that carried something foul beneath it. Dan's hand tightened on Dale's shoulder. "What's funny?" Dale turned his head just enough for Dan to see his eyes. "You think you saved her." His voice had a calm, icy certainty that struck deeper than any threat. "You think this ends here?" Dan felt a chill carve its way through his spine. What are you talking about? Dale smiled, teeth stained with sand and blood. She wasn't the only one. Silence crashed over the rest stop. Emily's breath hitched. The canines all shifted their stance at once, sensing the shift in energy, muscles tensing like coiled iron. Dan's heart hammered. What do you mean, not the only one? He demanded. Dale didn't answer. He just kept smiling, that sick, satisfied smile of a man who believed he still had power over the room. Major stepped closer, nose inches from Dale's cheek, growl rising in a deep rumble that sent vibrations through the asphalt. Dale's smile faltered, just a little. And in that flicker, Dan saw the truth. This wasn't a lone predator. This was the opening to something bigger, much bigger. And it was far from over. Dale Kincaid's chilling words hung in the air long after he was dragged away in handcuffs. The desert felt suddenly larger, darker, as if the land itself was holding secrets beneath its blistered skin. And the canines felt it first. Every one of them stayed tense, ears pivoting toward the ridge, bodies coiled with instinct that said the threat wasn't over. Dan Hale didn't waste time. Team 1, stay on Emily. Team 2, you're with me, he ordered. We sweep the ridge again. We're not leaving until we know exactly what he meant. Major was already ahead of him, nose to the wind, paws moving with a fierce determination that left no room for doubt. The other dogs followed, their formation instinctive, precise, as if the desert were a battlefield they had crossed hundreds of times. The heat had begun to fade, shadows stretching longer across the sand. The landscape felt thinner, stripped of its earlier calm. And the deeper the team moved behind the rest stop, the more the silence pressed against them. Major stopped first. At the base of a rock outcrop, half hidden by brush and dust, lay a length of rope. Not old, not sun-scorched. Fresh fibers, frayed ends, tied with the same knot that had bound Emily. "Rope," Trent called out. "Same kind." Dan crouched beside it, jaw tightening. Major didn't wait for permission. He moved left, sniffing along the sand where footprints from before had already begun to fade. Another dog, Valor, barked once sharply. Dan jogged toward him. A second rope, then a third. 3 ropes, all similar length, all dropped or abandoned in a rush. Dan felt something, cold settle into his chest. He wasn't improvising, he was preparing. The other handlers exchanged uneasy glances. Major growled suddenly, low and deep. Dan followed his gaze. Caught on a broken cactus limb was a scrap of fabric, a child's backpack, torn clean down the middle. The cartoon print was faded, but still visible. Something meant for small hands, something that didn't belong in the middle of a desert. Dan swallowed. We need to bag everything. The dogs weren't done. They moved farther up the ridge, sniffing with increased urgency. Near a patch of mesquite, the sand had been disturbed. A shallow depression, a dragging mark, a heel print. Then a set of tire tracks, narrow but fresh, cutting a clean arc away from the ridge towards the highway. A second vehicle, not Dale's. Dan felt his stomach drop. Someone else was here. Someone got away minutes before we arrived. Major pressed his nose into the dirt, breathing deeply, his body growing more rigid by the second. He pawed the ground once, twice, then looked up at Dan. Dan met his eyes. I know, boy. Someone else was involved. Behind them, an officer radioed in. We're calling in a full search grid. We need air support and state units. This is bigger than a single abduction. Not an abduction, Dan corrected quietly. A network. Back at the rest stop, Emily sat inside the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket too big for her small frame. Her breathing had steadied, though her eyes still carried the echo of the desert's shadows. One of the canines, Diesel, sat pressed against her leg like a living anchor. Major trotted towards her, breath still quick from tracking. The moment Emily saw him, her shoulders sagged with something like relief. She reached for his fur, fingers trembling. Dan knelt beside her. "Emily, I need to ask you something important. Was Dale working alone?" She shook her head immediately. "There was another voice?" She whispered. "On the phone. They were arguing. He said they'd return." Dan felt the room shift again. The medic beside him stiffened. The other handlers exchanged looks filled with worry, not surprise. Emily's eyes flicked up toward him, wide and honest. "He said I wasn't the only one." Dan exhaled slowly, forcing calm into his voice. "You did so good, Emily. You helped us more than you know." She reached for Major again, gripping his fur like she was afraid he might vanish. "He won't leave you," Dan said. "None of us will." Within minutes, the rest stop transformed into a controlled command center. Patrol cars lined the entrance. Radios crackled non-stop. Helicopter blades drummed in the distance as state troopers were dispatched. The K-9 unit reorganized, handlers prepping gear, water, and shade valves for their dogs. Major ignored the flurry of activity. He stayed beside Emily, leaning his massive head against her shoulder in a rare show of softness. Every time someone approached too quickly, he stepped forward, reading intentions before humans could. Dan took a moment to breathe. For the first time since the chase began, he really looked at Emily. She wasn't shaking as badly now. Her breathing was steadier. But her eyes held the kind of exhaustion only terror could carve into a child. "You're safe now," Dan said. Emily nodded, then whispered, "Because he heard me." Her voice trembled but stayed steady enough to say the words. "Major heard me when no one else did." Major pressed closer. Emily leaned into him, finding comfort in the dog who had crossed a desert of noise to hear a signal quieter than breath. As the search operation expanded into the night, Dan stood with the K-9 unit at the edge of the desert. The sun finally sank beneath the horizon, leaving behind streaks of burnt orange and violet. But for Dan, the darkness wasn't peaceful. It felt like the beginning of something bigger, the opening to a case no one had realized existed. 3 ropes, a torn backpack, fresh tire tracks, another voice on the phone, and a little girl who had survived only because 14 police dogs listened to what humans could not. Dan looked down at Major, who sat tall, eyes fixed on the open desert. "We're not done," Dan murmured. Major didn't blink. He already knew. A week later, the desert rest stop looked ordinary again. Cars pulled in and out. Families stretched their legs. The heat shimmered just the same. But for the people who had been there that day, for the officers who still replayed the scene in their heads, nothing about the place felt ordinary anymore. And for Emily Carter, life had shifted in ways only a child's heart could fully understand. She sat in the lobby of the Clark County Sheriff's Office, legs dangling off the cushioned bench, her small hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate. A bandage still circled one wrist, but the trembling that once lived in her fingers had slowly faded. Then the glass doors opened. Her mother rushed in. The sob that broke from her throat was raw and relieved, the kind that came from 7 days of not sleeping, not breathing, not daring to hope too much. She collapsed to her knees, arms wrapping around Emily so tightly the girl disappeared in her embrace. "You're home," her mother whispered, burying her face in Emily's hair. "You're really home." Emily clung to her, eyes squeezed shut, the safety of her mother's arms finally settling into her bones. Dan Hale watched from a few feet away, hands on his hips, exhaustion still etched into the corners of his face. He wasn't alone. The entire K-9 unit stood with him, each handler beside their partner dog. But it was Major who held Emily's attention. When she finally let go of her mother long enough to breathe, her gaze found the big German shepherd towering beside Dan. "Major," she whispered. The dog trotted forward, tail held in a slow, steady sway. Not excited, not restless, something gentler, something like recognition. Emily reached out. Major lowered his head into her hands, as if the two had been meeting like this their whole lives. Her fingers sank into his fur, her shoulders relaxing with a soft breath that carried more healing than any words she had managed all week. Her mother covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes again. Dan stepped up beside them. "He's been asking about you?" he said, smiling lightly. Emily smiled back, tiny but real, the kind that came from a place finally touched by safety. Later that afternoon, the department held the press conference that had been brewing since the day of the rescue. Reporters gathered under a pop-up tent, cameras trained on a row of handlers and their dogs. Flashbulbs snapped. Microphones were raised. The sheriff spoke first, recounting the timeline, the pursuit, the arrest. But when he motioned toward the K9 unit, the crowd shifted forward. "These dogs," he said, "saved a child's life by hearing what no human could." Major sat at the center of the row, perfectly still, perfectly alert, amber eyes scanning the crowd. He wasn't performing for the cameras. He didn't understand the applause. But he understood Emily. She stood off to the side with her mother, clutching a small, folded piece of paper in her hand. When the sheriff invited her up, she stepped forward shyly, the cameras clicking in a soft wave. Dan knelt beside her, and Major moved with him, sitting tall like a guardian carved from something ancient. Emily unfolded the paper with careful fingers. "This is for the K9 team," she said, voice quiet. The sheriff took the paper and read it into the microphone. "Tell Major, he heard me when no one else could." Silence broke into a ripple of emotion across the room. Some reporters swallowed hard. Some parents in the crowd wiped their eyes. Even Dan had to look away for a moment, blinking back the sudden burn in his chest. Major leaned into Emily gently, pressing his head against her side as she read the line again under her breath. "He heard me." Dan rested a hand on Major's back. "He always will." But even in the warmth of the moment, even in the healing that filled the lobby, a darker thread still wound its way through the department. Because Dale Kincaid hadn't been lying. Evidence from the ridge confirmed it. Multiple ropes, a torn backpack, fresh tire tracks leading south. Another voice on the phone. A second suspect still unaccounted for. They had saved Emily, but someone else had slipped away. As the conference ended and the crowd thinned, Emily hugged Major one last time. The dog pressed a paw gently against her knee, a silent promise that the nightmares would have to go through him now. Outside, as the sun dipped low, washing the city in soft gold, Dan stood with Major at his side. The evening breeze stirred the dog's fur. Major didn't look toward Emily's departing car. He looked toward the desert. Alert. Still listening. Still hunting. Because the story wasn't over. The story should have ended at the rest stop. At least that was what most people hoped. A girl rescued. A kidnapper caught. A team of dogs hailed as heroes. But sometimes a single moment echoes far beyond the place it happened. Emily's tiny heel tap, softer than a breath, had shaken more than one department. It shook an entire country awake. Within days, national news outlets picked up the tape from the sheriff's office press conference. Clips of Major leaping into the truck bed played on every screen. The footage of Emily hugging him, her small face buried in his fur, left even hardened reporters speechless. Commentators called it instinct, courage, divine timing. But parents everywhere saw something different. A child who had been unable to scream, yet still found a way to call for help. The wave of attention grew so large the Clark County Sheriff's Office had to assign a dedicated spokesperson. Emails poured in from teachers, parents, trauma specialists, youth counselors, and survivors. They all echoed the same plea: teach kids how to signal when they cannot speak. That was how the Silent Signals program was born. It started small, just an idea tossed around during a strategy meeting. But when they asked Dan Hale if he'd lead it, he didn't hesitate. He had seen what silence could cost, and what a tiny sound, heard by the right ears, could save. Dan stood in a newly renovated training room the following month, sunlight slanting across the polished floor. Posters lined the walls, each one showing different low-movement distress signals, tapping patterns on solid surfaces, toe movements, wrist motions, breathing cues, techniques children could use without drawing attention. Silent signals. The banner read. In the center of the room sat Major. He lay like a statue of living steel, ears forward, tracking every noise. 12 elementary-age kids sat in a half-circle around him. Some shy, others curious, all slightly nervous. "Okay," Dan said, kneeling beside Major. "You remember what we talked about? Signals don't have to be loud. They don't have to be big. They just have to be intentional." A boy raised his hand. "Will a dog always hear it?" Dan smiled a little. "Not always, but these dogs, they hear more than we think." He tapped the metal bench lightly. 2 soft taps, 1 long scrape. Major's ears lifted. He rose slowly to his feet, turning toward the bench. The kids gasped. "That's what saved Emily," Dan said quietly. "A rhythm only the dogs picked up." Emily herself wasn't present. Her mother had asked for some time away from the public eye. But her drawing, framed on the wall behind Dan, spoke for her. A child sketch of Major standing guard over a small girl in a truck bed. Above his head she'd written, "He heard me." Major walked to the bench and nudged it, waiting. Even the children could see he understood something was expected of him. Dan touched his collar. He's still listening, even when it's quiet. The room felt different after that, softer, calmer. Some kids tentatively tried tapping their shoes. A girl grazed her fingernail along the wall. Another boy whispered a pattern into his cupped hands. Major's ears never rested. After the class, Dan leaned against the wall, letting the energy drain from his shoulders. Major pressed against his leg, sensing the weight of everything that had changed. "You were born for this," Dan murmured. Major simply looked up with steady amber eyes. No pride, no confusion, just readiness. That was when an unexpected knock sounded on the door. A deputy peeked inside. "Dan, you have a visitor. Says he wants to talk to you specifically." Dan stepped out into the hallway, his muscles tensing the moment he recognized the man waiting near the chairs. It was the drifter from the ridge. The jittery one they had first mistaken for the suspect. This time he stood cleaned up, wearing a borrowed shirt and looking like someone trying hard not to run from his own shadow. "Can we talk?" he asked. Dan motioned to a bench. "You're not in trouble. You can sit." The man swallowed hard. "I didn't know," he said immediately. "That day, when your dogs came at me, I thought you were going to shoot me." "You were hiding," Dan said. "We had to check." The man nodded. "I know, I get that now. What changed?" He exhaled, long and slow. "After that day, I couldn't stop thinking about the girl, about how scared she must have been. I've slept rough before, but nothing like that. Nothing like being alone and unable to yell." Dan said nothing. The man rubbed his hands together. "I went back to the ridge. Found something. Figured it mattered." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded map. When Dan opened it, he saw hand-drawn circles, paths and coordinates marked with careful pen strokes. "I saw a second truck earlier that day," the man said. "Didn't think anything of it then, but now I think it was connected. I wrote down where I saw it go. Dan felt something tighten behind his ribs, a lead they hadn't been able to pin down, and now it was being handed to him by the one man they had nearly arrested. "Why help us?" Dan asked. The drifter's voice dipped. "Because your dog didn't bite me when he could have. He knew I wasn't the one. He looked at me like he saw something true. No one's done that in a long time." Major appeared in the doorway, head tilted, watching the stranger. The man swallowed. "Tell him thanks, will you?" Dan folded the map carefully. "How about you tell him yourself?" The man hesitated, then met Major's gaze. "Thanks, boy." Major blinked once, then stepped closer, touching his nose lightly to the man's sleeve. The man froze, breath catching in his throat as if that one small gesture meant more than any handshake ever could. When he left, Dan stood in the hallway a long moment, looking at the map. A new route, a second vehicle, a path leading deep into the Nevada basin, another thread in a story that wasn't finished. He looked down at Major. "You ready to follow this through?" Major held his stare, unwavering. Always. And in the quiet of the late afternoon, with the training room humming behind them and the future crawling open ahead, Dan felt something settle inside him. A legacy didn't come from medals or headlines. It came from the smallest signals. A heel tap, a flicker in a dog's ear, a man deciding to step forward instead of running away. And Major had taught all of them how to listen. The studio lights were warmer than the desert sun, softer but still bright enough to make Dan blink as he settled into the chair. The backdrop behind him showed a blurred image of the Nevada highway, a symbolic nod to the place where everything had unfolded. Cables snaked across the floor. A cameraman counted down with his fingers. The host, a polished woman in her 40s with the calm voice of someone who'd covered both wars and weddings, leaned forward. "Officer Hale," she began. "The world has heard Emily's story. The country has heard about Major. But people still wonder, how did you know? How did you sense something was wrong before anyone else?" Dan inhaled slowly, glancing to his right. Major lay at his feet, paws crossed, posture tall but relaxed. He wore no medal, no special harness, just his working collar and a quiet confidence that made the entire crew instinctively keep their distance. Dan rested a hand on the dog's head. "I didn't," he said. A small smile touched his mouth, the kind that held truth rather than pride. "He did." The host raised an eyebrow slightly, almost expecting him to elaborate. Dan did. "Humans walk through the world with our eyes," he said, voice clear and steady. "But dogs, they walk through it with their whole being. They felt the silence before anyone heard a thing. The girl sent a signal so soft it was nearly nothing, but Major refused to ignore it." He looked down again. Major didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, as if the memory of that day was something he could still smell in the air. The host shifted in her seat. "And when you saw him reacting, you trusted him immediately." "I didn't have a choice," Dan answered. "When a dog like Major sounds an alarm, you listen. He'd saved soldiers overseas. He'd saved officers in the field. And that day, he saved a child who had no voice left to use." A moment of silence came from the crew. The cameras kept rolling. The host glanced at her notes. "There's a lesson in this, isn't there? Something about instinct? Or courage?" Dan shook his head gently. "It's about paying attention to the quiet things," he said. "The moments we'd normally overlook. A tap, a breath, a change in posture. Dogs notice what we miss. They feel what we ignore." The host leaned back. "And what does this mean for the future of the Silent Signals program?" "It means we're not finished," Dan replied. "The second suspect is still out there. There are more children who need to know how to ask for help when their voices fail, but it also means we have partners who can hear what we don't. His hand stayed on Major's head, fingers brushing through the shepherd's fur. The camera operator gestured for a close-up. The lens zoomed in, slowly, deliberately. Major's eyes filled the screen. Calm, amber bright, steady, ancient in a way only dogs of service ever look. Eyes that seemed to hold entire stories no human language could tell. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Dan lifted his gaze to the camera, meeting the audience directly through the lens. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" he asked. The words didn't feel like an ending. They felt like an invitation, a doorway for every viewer who had ever trusted a dog, loved one, or been saved by one. The host closed the segment gracefully, thanking Dan for his service and praising Major's heroism. But even as the studio lights dimmed and the crew began to pack up, Major remained still, eyes fixed on the shadows behind the camera, listening to sounds no one else noticed. Dan stood, patting the dog's shoulder. "Let's go, partner," he murmured. Major rose in a single smooth motion. Not rushed, not tired, just ready. Because loyalty, real loyalty, didn't end when the cameras shut off. It followed you out the door. It kept watch long after the world thought the danger was gone. As they walked toward the exit, a studio intern whispered, "I've never seen a dog like that." Dan smiled softly without turning back. "Most people haven't." Outside, the night air carried the faint hum of traffic. Major paused at the doorway, nose lifting to the breeze. A habit, a promise, a reminder. Emily's signal had been just one story. There would be more to hear, more to protect, more to save, and Major would be ready for all of them. To the viewers who followed these stories, to those who believed in the courage of working dogs, Dan offered one final message as the door swung open and Major stepped into the night beside him. "If you want more real stories of courage," he said, "more true moments of instinct, loyalty, and heart, follow the channel, support the canines, support the German Shepherd heroes who listen when no one else can." Major's tail swayed once, a silent signal, a quiet promise, a legacy still unfolding.